Thank you all for joining us. My name is Erasma Beras-Monticciolo, and I am your host for Powering Up with Power of Two, in which we engage with community leaders, residents, and advocates to talk about the pressing issues affecting families and children in New York City and the steps that we can each take as individuals and as a collective to ensure the health and well-being of our communities. A couple of reminders before we begin. Closed captioning is available for those differently abled. We also encourage you to please share your questions with us in the chat. At Power of Two, we recognize that our partnership with families is part of a larger ecosystem that influences child development. That ecosystem includes family, community, including larger society, healthcare, education, and childcare. In fact, according to the National Survey of Early Care and Education Project Team, nearly 7 million children are enrolled in childcare early learn centers in the United States. And approximately 60% of those children are 3 years old or younger. Therefore, childcare and early education are essential for the physical health of families with young children, but also essential to their economic and emotional well-being. Childcare and early education has been an area that has often been ignored by policymakers for a very long time. It was undervalued and therefore underfunded until the COVID crisis. The Biden-Harris administration, for example, recognizes that caring for children is crucial to a functioning economy, and as such has proposed spending $225 billion over 10 years to subsidize childcare, including capping costs for low and moderate income families, boosting pay and training for childcare workers, and providing federal dollars for care centers. Our guest today, Mel Jackman, and I will engage in a conversation about the Biden-Harris plan, as well as what she and her team are doing to help reframe our policymakers' thinking about education and childcare in our communities. Mel has a long-standing history of prioritizing a vision of equity, academic excellence, and inquiry for students and families, and currently serves as executive director of the Brooklyn Kindergarten Society. The Brooklyn Kindergarten Society was founded in Brooklyn approximately 130 years ago and provides a high-quality toddler and preschool educational program to more than 400 students in Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brownsville, and Crown Heights neighborhoods. Mel, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, I'm so glad to be here.
Wonderful to have you. So Mel, you have a long career in education that includes leadership positions within public schools in New York City. What led you on this journey, and what is your personal connection to the work?
That's a great question. I am a public school baby. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and my entire educational experience has been through public schools in the city. I think one thing that has been unique about my experience, very early in my educational career, someone saw something in me that kind of othered me. And I got tracked on this path of being in the gifted and talented space, and also even attending a specialized high school in New York City. And through that experience, I was afforded multiple opportunities and experiences, and I grew a love of education. I had a strong confidence in who I could be. But I also have a brother who came from the exact same household that I came from. We were from East New York, and I still live there. And he went to the local high school, Thomas Jefferson High School, still around today. And we've had two completely different experiences. And it was glaring to me. And I didn't have the language when I was 17 and 18, 21, and even 25 about the inequities in our systems and how nurture and nature truly exist. And when there's economic and school and disparities, the outcomes for children are gaping. And that experience of having this amazing academic experience and watching my brother, who lived in the exact same household, have a different experience really propelled my love and need to create equitable experiences in education. And I've been committed to ensuring that children who all children are deemed brilliant, amazing, curious, and you shouldn't have to be tracked into a G&T or a specialized school to know your brilliance and your excellence. And my goal is to create these spaces where all children, no matter where you come from, what school you go to in this city, you have a fair chance of having an equal step in your education and your outcomes for yourself. So that's why I do this work. This is why I work in the community in which I still live in. And this is what my entire educational stance has been about, providing this equitable space for all children, all learners, no matter where you live. I'm in this city.
Mel, thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate that. I am a big believer that the personal is political, and the political is personal. And so having you and hearing you share that is so important and motivating, right? And inspiring, because I had a similar experience to yours. I grew up in Brownsville, Brooklyn, and I was very early on othered and went to a specialized high school and saw my trajectory, how my trajectory was very different from, my neighbors, my friends in the same building that were going to, a local school. So thank you for sharing that and for calling it out, right? Because that exists, right? And has existed for generations, even before us. And I appreciate your commitment to tapping into that and building equity as a result. There has been a lot of conversation and emphasis on, early learning and childcare recently. It's something that, as I mentioned in the intro, has been ignored for generations and for decades by our policymakers. And it's something that, when thinking about childcare, it was something that was, specifically relegated to women, right? Only. And as women began to, become part of the workforce, then there was a little bit of a shift in, okay, well, how do we support women's involvement and engagement in the workforce, and also, ensure that they're able to care for children, right? But not enough attention was paid to that, maybe until the 1990s, and even very little since then. And now we're seeing a shift, and obviously the COVID crisis has really served as an impetus for that. And so I am really curious to hear your thoughts on the recent investments that we're seeing in childcare. And specifically, what are some of the highlights from the American Rescue Plan Act that you're most excited about?
Well, the plan it's a monstrous document, and there's so many pieces, and even biting into it is, what do you gravitate towards? So at BKS, we have 3 strategic priorities that focus on high quality outcomes for students, strong family and community relationships, and creating a culture of learning and inquiry for adults. So with that lens, I was able to unpack the document and drill into the pieces that were aligned to our current work. So in my mind, I have them also delineated into 3 prongs. The pieces that affect families, the pieces that affect CEOs and organizations like BKS, and the pieces that impact our community. So when I start with our families first, really excited about the nutritional and supplemental food supports that are available, improvements to WIC benefits. When we think about who we serve and what the ages that families are eligible to receive WIC benefits, and modernizing those systems, that is huge. The pandemic EBT program, supplemental food for families. Kids have been home doing remote learning. That is an extra expense on households that you have to consider. And of course, the emergency rental assistance. We're thinking about Maslow's needs. You have to have your home, that being very secure, so that you can function and be confident. So if our families have these pieces being supported, you start thinking about how that starts to trickle down into our students. But in addition, the advance on the child tax credit program, payment, is one of the most profound ways to start to really think about how we can shift the dynamics of poverty in this country, and the eligibility of who's eligible to receive those payments. It really does gamut a spectrum in a way that has been profound. It hasn't been done before, and it has a lot of legs to do so much. We can talk about some pushes and some things to really boost it up for another conversation, maybe. But in regards to CBOs and organizations, the $1 billion to Head Start. Um, 5 of BK centers receive Head Start funding. That is transformative for us and what we are able to do with our students and our staff and our facilities and our spaces to really keep high standards. And most recently, the application for the Child Care Stabilization Grant has opened. And the application comes with a ton of support, clear directions. It's straightforward in a gamut of ways that you can use the money to support expenses that you would have increased due to COVID. Expenses increase about overall on average about 47%,
Wow.
which is significant. Hasn't been budgeted for, and that creates huge deficits in pockets of the budget. So being able to recover from that is essential. And lastly, when we think about our community in which our families live, and for BKS, our community is also in NYCHA public housing. All 7 of our centers are located in NYCHA communities. And, there's another level, there's another ecosystem to unpack. What it means to live in these spaces and the historic inequities that are just prevalent and pervasive. And I'm really excited about the mental health resources, vaccine education, distribution, and testing. The AARP can be transformative. I think there's some work for us for all stakeholders, all the lay folks too, who are not just spending time unpacking it to understand what the implications are for where you fall and what stakeholder group that you live in, work in, and overall, say is your ecosystem. And that's some work to be further done to unpack that and educate. But overall, there's so much happening, and figuring out how to systematize and incorporate and share information is the next phase of the work to really see the impact of this Rescue Plan Act.
Thank you, Mel. I was talking to a few friends of mine that are also in education and in childcare, and they're like, what, we're kind of like, is it real? Is this really happening? And can we really trust that it's going to be a long-term investment, or is it just going to be, short-term, and then they're going to pull the rug from under us? And I say, well, we have it, and we have to advocate and make sure that not just us as leaders, but also that community as a whole is involved and mobilized to ensure that there's a continuation of this support and this funding for the long term, right? Mm-hmm. Because as you know, this is critical. It is critical, particularly in the early years for our children and families, right? So the investment is really important now. Especially as we look to future generations, mm-hmm. and it's really we're unclear about the impact that the pandemic has had, right? We know about the physical, and we have an inkling and some insight, and my organization works directly with families on nurturance, and so we have some insight into the impact that the pandemic is having on mental health, but we just don't know how mm-hmm. long, right? Mm-hmm. How long that tail mm-hmm. of that impact will be. Mm-hmm. And so I really love the fact that you have these 3 tiers that you're focusing your energy on. That's really terrific. And just a follow-up question about that, right? Related to the support for organizations like yours, and the type of professional development that you're excited about, that you feel that the AARP is going to be able to allow you to do some more PD for your team. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yes, I get the most excited about professional development. And it's part of our 3rd strategic priority of really creating this adult culture of learning and inquiry. Mm-hmm. And then when you think about BKS and how our centers or our learning spaces are codified, they're all very unique, and there's a multitude of individuals that create this learning space. Center directors, members of the teaching team, which have a variety of aides, assistants, and lead teachers, cooks and custodians, family service team members. Everyone has a role to play. So this adult learning is not only about teachers at BKS or members of the teacher teams or the center leaders. Everyone goes through a process of continuous learning, continuous reflection, intentionality. Our bookkeepers, everyone is thinking about, how does my role impact the outcomes of students? So it's a holistic approach, and everyone is going through it. So we're very thoughtful about our financial systems, and the bookkeepers are thinking about, so how do I support enrollment and recruitment? What's happening in the classroom? We encourage folks to see, to be able to internalize the work, but also grow in themselves. Because when the adults are doing the work with themselves, and teachers, the whole gamut, unpacking biases, looking at mindset, incorporating new pedagogical insights, and doing that self-reflective work, then we create these same spaces and opportunities for our kids. It's holistic. There's nothing siloed. There's no just doing a job. It's so much about, who am I as a learner? How do I show up during challenges? How do I problem solve? Because these are the things, when I think about when I'm hiring someone, I'm looking for these skills and that excitement. But that's the exact same thing we want for our children. It's not taught in a separate advisory class on how to build emotional fortitude or how to problem solve and make it a specific lesson. It's intentional, you're immersed, and the adults have to be immersed and see themselves as continuous learners to perpetuate that same energy with our students. And because we teach 2 to 5-year-olds and developmentally at that age, so much that you learn is through what you see, what's modeled for you, what you hear, and what you're allowed to experience. All adults have to show up the right way, with a way, when I say the right way, a mindset of learning, inquiry, trying, figuring things out, learning from mistakes, that growth mindset from the very beginning. And we beget children who see school as a learning opportunity. We grow children who seek understanding and not doing work. Language is so important in professional development and how we shift perceptions and paradigms. And when folks are very cognizant and aware of the language that they use and how they show up and how children are taking that in, the professional development starts to sink in, and you see the outcomes of your children. And when you have pre-readers, and when routines and transitions and rituals mean so much, the adults have to model it. You just can't teach it or do it and not really be bought in. It won't be a natural transference. So PD, professional development learning, every single stakeholder is going through it continuously at our center level, at our main office, at our board. It's a constant state of reflection, revision, and then an action. I like to read.
Yeah, no, I love it. And I love the fact that you just lit up as soon as I asked that question. You're like, yes, I love this. What's interesting to me when listening to you talk, it just reminds me of, our indigenous values, right? Where we recognize that it's the community that is learning alongside children, right? And that we're centering the child, but that we're all involved in their development, but we're also involved in our own learning, right? And what that creates is a sense of community. And I remember when you and I chatted earlier this week, or maybe last week, we talked about something that you all do to help build community that I just find incredibly powerful and fascinating. And if you don't mind, I'm going to put you on the spot. If you can share your communal gathering and eating, your team and the children together, and what that does and what that means.
Yeah, I think something special. And COVID has definitely, if there's any members of the Department of Health, COVID has definitely shifted our practices.
Right.
But something that BKS and in most early childhood CBO spaces, family style eating, the importance of it, and so much learning that happens when folks come together, break bread, talk about the day, the excitement, but also learn the social cues and norms. So much learning happens there. In traditional spaces, and I've spent time in traditional public schools as a teacher first, and then administrator, and always made time to go to lunch duty. There's something special that happens when you sit down with a child, break bread, and eat. But normally you're there, and when you're in a public school setting, to observe, to supervise, to make sure all is well and copacetic. But when we center it down to that family style space, it starts to mimic some of the values and the wants that families have at home, or routines that families have at home. And it has a beautiful transference to students. So you start to see there's an opportunity for that beautiful homeschool connection. And in early childhood, with pre-readers and children who are learning about their world, that continuity, that experience, it fosters joy and love. And sometimes those terms are not, there's no way to codify it or assess it or evaluate it or grade it. But that joy and love these are emotions that are essential for children feeling confident, comfortable, courageous, and having that isn't so important. So I'm excited for when that can be fully brought back. The pandemic has definitely shifted, but we found ways to mimic or revise it while staying safe and healthy and being in full compliance.
Right. Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. Speaking, I want to speak a little bit to the pandemic, right? So I'm curious about some of the challenges that you notice with families during the pandemic, and for most of our communities, the pandemic isn't over, right? It's still very much present, and we're navigating, systems with this existing experience. What has been, BKS's, response? How did you shift programming, and what are some of the lessons that you've learned that you're thinking that you're going to continue to implement going forward?
That is a question. The lessons, of course, that really, when you take a step back, but BKS, we closed in 2020 and we opened our doors August of 2020. And at that time, childcare workers were deemed quote unquote essential workers. So when most of the city was still closed, public schools still closed, serving the same age range, still closed, the team was called to action. We need to be open because we need folks to have reliable, safe, nurturing childcare for the emotional and social development of their children, but also to allow folks to earn a living, a wage. And essential workers, it's so controversial who those folks were and how they're compensated. A whole nother conversation too.
Yes, indeed.
A whole nother conversation. But we were essential to supporting the city to function, allowing our families to work when they didn't have the luxury of working from home, or the privilege from working from home, or the comfort from working from home, however you knock it. They had to be out there allowing the city to function in this really uncertain time. So BKS, we noticed in August that there was some food insecurity in our neighborhoods. We gave out about roughly 5,000 meals to families. And that was just through support from the Robin Hood Foundation and donations that came in from our sponsors and our board members to really ensure that we were meeting this pressing need. So that was one of the major ways. We also made sure that we gave technology to all families that needed it, and remote learning at a preschool level, ages 3 and up, tricky. We didn't do it before. We had to learn, pivot, create professional development, learn new best practices, but also train the staff up on all the new systems. We weren't that kind of org. We've been around for 130 years. We had some pretty clear ways of how we did things. So making that pivot and quickly and really ramping up learning for everyone. So families were receiving technology, but BKS, a full implementation of how we were able to start working remotely or working off site and making sure we weren't skipping a beat on learning experiences for students and families. So the rollout of technology across for all stakeholders was huge. The differentiation of professional development to supplement that, huge. The 5,000 meals that we provided, huge, but also being very intentional due to the stakeholders on the leadership team here of also supporting local Black businesses in the neighborhood, being intentional of who we were getting our food supply from so that we could spread and share the resources to ensure that people stayed in business too. It was all
Right.
two. It's always thinking about how does one connect to the other? And of course, being a resource for our families, our open ear. We still conducted versions of virtual home visits, a time to check in with our families, to see how kids are doing, to make recommendations of what needs to happen to the classroom, to really start to understand where kids were and where parents were. We kept having our family meetings and our leadership meetings with our families to make sure that we created some type of normalcy during all this change and chaos and uncertainty.
Right.
Essential. And all of that, you start to think about, what did we learn throughout? What did we learn throughout? I think about it probably in threes again. Probably in
Yeah.
threes again. But the importance of regular check-ins with our families. And not just having a conversation about a student's academic progress or social emotional needs, but a real heart-to-heart check-in. How are you?
Mhm.
How are you doing as a full human? I see, I hear you. There's all this happening, and let's
Mhm.
talk. Providing that space for families through our family service team, center directors, and making myself available to answer questions, to be a sounding board, to even bring things of concern so that we could make our practices better. There was something about not being paternalistic during this time and just making the decisions for everyone because in the best interest. Perspectives matter, voice matters, and creating an opportunity for that to funnel through, essential. It's a must.
Right.
Pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, it has to just happen. Voice and choice in the classroom, we all know this one matters so much for students. Essential, especially when in the earlier days of the pandemic, when we had a stronger mask mandates, going to classrooms and still visiting classrooms during a pandemic, seeing how silent it was because their mouths were almost like shushed because they had their coverings on.
Yeah. Yeah.
And thinking about the importance of language development. It has to be what we think about moving forward, and how we get kids moving and touching and feeling, but expressing themselves. Since there was a little delay in what a mask does to a early language speaker, learning language, understanding it, and I have a mask over my face. I'm not seeing the lips
That's
being.
right. They can't see exactly.
Yeah, there's so
Yeah.
much about that, right? The adults adapted because we start looking at our eyes and other expressions, but you have to learn that. When I'm just learning language and I'm just starting to speak at 2 and 3, and we're at different spectrums, the eye expression may not always communicate what you want or need or how to express yourself. So I learned that's a real focus. Of course, supporting students' emotional and social well-being, but also demystifying the jargon around that so that
Mhm.
families could access and not feel like there's so much jargon I can't help my child at home too. There's something about that happens in education, and I've learned from this experience to make things accessible to different stakeholders and different people. It's almost like we differentiate lesson plans. You
Mhm.
differentiate communication so that folks can internalize and then have an actionable next step or ask questions to support their learning. Um, and lastly, I've learned that routines, rituals, and transitions are essential for all the folks in this ecosystem. It creates a sense of safety when all this change is happening. It was a lesson in change management.
That's right.
It was a lesson in change management, and there's some key features that we can continue to apply as the world is still changing to support not only students' emotional well-being, but the adults, because the adults have to be, we ask them to be solid. We ask them to show up every day and give them all, but they have to be emotionally and have that emotional fortitude at the same time. So a lesson that came from that was incorporating self-care into our professional development and allocating resources for the adults and when I say adults, it's the families and or staff to really have opportunities to reflect, take some time for themselves. We have a Shine app that you can meditate at work and take mental health breaks. We've done yoga via Zoom as a team, and yoga passes for folks. Really thinking intentional about the human that we have, and also education. BKS we're doing some good vaccine outreach, and we had some doctors from New York Presbyterian and a local doctor in the neighborhood really come to educate about the vaccine when it was just starting to come out and just
That's right.
becoming a
Yeah.
thing, to really inform the community, inform the team about what to expect and answer questions. So we did a lot of things. We're still learning, doing, and evolving, and we're still learning. So those are the initial lessons. But I feel, Erasma, that there'll be so many more lessons to come.
Absolutely. It's ever evolving, right? It's ever changing, and there's constant shifts, right, in understanding and awareness, and the lessons that we have learned we'll just be able to, they're foundational, but we'll be able to build upon, right? And one of the things that I find really inspiring about what you shared, and there's a lot that you shared that I find really motivating, is the humanity component, right?
Mm-hmm.
And making sure that there's an acknowledgement and recognition that you have a team that may live in the community themselves, right? That
Mm-hmm.
must have opportunities for reflection, must have an opportunity for self-care, and that you're bringing also the community in to be part of the dialogue, be part of the thinking, be part of the co-designing of what this learning environment is like. And and I want to follow up on that a little bit, because I know that BKS has a parent advisory board, and
Yes.
so I want to get a sense of how involved were they, through the pandemic, and how are they involved now?
Mm-hmm.
What kinds of decisions are you all co-creating together and making together?
Ah, yes, I love, and it's a longer acronym, DASPC. All Head Start funded organizations need to have a parent advisory board, but all BKS sites are not
Mm-hmm.
Head Start funded. But at BKS, it runs the gamut. Everyone is a part of this. There's no exclusion. So even in our sites that are not obligated to have one, of course we have one. And of course we mingle the two together. And of course we are one united front. And one thing that we've done through our parent advisory board is to create space for parents to say what they would want. What do
Mm.
you want? What would you want for your child? And we had an initial conversation during the middle of the pandemic, and we were talking about kids' experiences. We have all our new health and safety guidelines and checklists and logs to the wazoo. It's everything is accounted for and thought about. Um, and a parent brought to my attention, like, this is great. I love the transparency. I love the pieces. I see what's in place. I feel safe sending my child. But what about the things that they used to love to do? There's no more field trips right now.
Mm.
Um, what else are the kids going to do enrichment wise? So we had a conversation about our enrichments. And would it be okay to start having outside providers when we're trying to keep our pods and our groups as sterile as possible to reduce infection? I said, is it okay to have a conversation about this? And are you ready? So we're
Mhm.
talking about our violin program and our tennis and our movement program. And are we ready to start doing this back to normalcy despite all the things, all the fears about the pandemic? And the parents said, yes, we're okay with it. We want it. And here are the things I want you to consider so that we feel safe.
Mm.
So my job was then to take the parents' recommendation, and because we have a very inclusive space, go to the center leaders and have a conversation with them, the leadership team at the central office, and talk about it. And at first, it was a very tough conversation. Not ready, not time. The parents wanted it. I went back to the parents. Here are some things that are coming up. Mel, we really need it. And when you start thinking about how you prioritize decisions, that parent voice for me was the one I had to uplift, bring back to other stakeholders, convince them buy in, and everyone loves it. Music and violin, tennis, movement is the hallmark of what we do, and kids have it multiple times a week. And that was something parents brought to my attention that they wanted, and giving them space to help dictate what their child experiences is important. To know that you can speak up and say it. A parent also brought to my attention a need to enhance our air purification system. And he sent a tough email. And I was like, oh, yeah, all right, let's talk about it. Not only did we get new air purification systems for the center that her child was at, we got it for every single center because she was thinking about her child, all the children, and brought something to my attention that needed more focus on. And to admit that and be vulnerable and say, oh, yeah, that was something that we need to do,
Right.
was paramount. And
That's community. That's community
yeah,
in action. Exactly.
that's community. Yeah. And now this parent is also going to be a part of our official board. So also taking leadership at our central level and shifting it to our board. So to be part of our board of directors and creating that space, because all of that is practice for more advocacy work. That's practice for more community work. I'm excited that we have a parent on our board of directors, and not just a checklist, but a parent that is going to be a part of the decision making. That is huge. I want to increase more of that, and looking forward to getting more parents on our board to really demystify what the work is, and have more representation of the community in a space that traditionally doesn't always seem accessible.
Right. Right. Yeah. You know, what's interesting, over the last few years, I've been hearing community voice and choice a lot. Right. And this is something that we've been doing, since we launched Power of Two in 2015. And I've been seeing the language in ACS with ACS. I've been seeing the language with the DOE. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you about was it specifically about that dynamic, the ACS. For folks that don't know the acronyms, ACS stands for Administration for Children's Services, and DOE is Department of Education. A couple of years ago, childcare transitioned from ACS to the Department of Education. And so there has been a shift in kind of thinking around strictly childcare model to a more teaching, education, academic model. And so I'm curious to hear from you, Mel, what are your thoughts about that transition from ACS to the DOE, and how are you noticing the differences, the positives about this shift, if any, from your standpoint?
And it's a unique position to be in because I spent 13 years in the Department of Education as a teacher and assistant principal. So much of those systems I see coming to fruition now with this shift. So managing that change is very innate for me. Someone not a part of that system and was a part of ACS for 25, 30 years. It is a learning curve in the processes, the protocols, the way information is disseminated, and the accountability that comes to the Department of Education, and the level of academic excellence and rigor that is implemented through everything. So I want to say that the learning curve is steep. It can be steep if you have not had experience with the Department of Education. The need to ask questions and problem solve is something that you have to dig deep in to really understand. And it's a lot of information. So how you take information, analyze information, disseminate it, and disaggregate it to different stakeholders, you have to build up your systems, establish your systems so that you have favorable outcomes. So a systems thinking mindset has to be at the core for this change to occur. And also the mindset of like what used to be had its space, and how we're evolving is a mindset to take on, because you have to get your team ready for that, because a child care model is not necessarily 100% the same as a school-based model. They're interchangeable parts. There's definitely things that are fully aligned, but when there is a requirement for all staff to be certified, and what certification implements in regards of degree attainment, coursework, and during from a time, and then we also have in the childcare world, there's levels of teachers. There's like almost this hierarchy of teachers that exists. You have your lead teacher, your assistant, and your aide, and they all make different salaries. And there's this interesting hierarchy that exists in a childcare model, where in the Department of Education, your salary is literally based on your experience, your master's, and if you increase your education with the 30 credits, and that's how that is done. So it's very interesting of how folks are compensated. It's very interesting the differences on how folks are compensated, how hierarchies show up in the space, but also because childcare models also goes to 6 p.m., where the Department of Education does not. There's some things that have to still be intact and remain, because no teacher can work from 8 to 6 p.m. So there's still elements of the daycare model that is infused, even though we're transitioned to the Department of Education. And that is the nuance. And getting folks to understand the nuances, the differences, embrace the change, and also continue to increase their certification and their professional degrees. It's an onward journey in a way that you didn't always have to do it before.
Right. And we can talk at length about this, but I know that we're coming up on time, and so I want to ask you, one last question as it relates to, policies in the city, and obviously, we're going into mayoral election in November, and so what are some policies you want city agencies to rethink when it comes to childcare and early childhood development? Either as a result of the mayoral election or the investment that the Biden-Harris administration is making in early childhood?
Yeah, that is a wonderful, wonderful question. And I think there's a couple of ways to approach it. I think to unpack the policies, I think about policies in alignment to the strategic priorities that we've been focusing on. High quality outcomes for students, the strong family and community relationships, and the culture of adult learning and inquiry. But I also think about the systems that exist that intersect with those priorities. So I think for the upcoming mayor election is important for healthcare leads, educational leads, child welfare leads. There needs to be almost like a listening tour to understand the priorities, the limiting beliefs or limiting factors that exist, and get folks talking to find the intersectionality about the common work, while keeping early childhood education at the core of the conversation, to see how all of this interacts and interplays. Because you can't think about early childhood education without thinking about the families that provide the support for their children, without thinking about the staff and the team members that provide the support, and the community and everyone lives. So those stakeholders need to come together, have a couple of conversations, look at some good data points and make an informed decision that would then allow the mayor to think about what's coming up and what policy needs to be reformed, revised, or what do we need to just go back to the drawing board to make more meaning and more sense. So there's a next step that needs to happen before I fully name the specific policies. But I'm looking forward to starting a conversation like that, getting some more stakeholders to unsilo these systems that exist, because it's the people who either perpetuate the systems
That's right.
enforce the systems and uphold them. And I want to get to that root.
Right. There's more collective action that needs to happen, and it must be focused on and centering families and children. And so, Mel, as we conclude our conversation today, what is a call to action that you would like to share with our audience?
We need to keep this conversation going. I want to invite folks on October 12th. BKS will be hosting a panel discussion about thinking about recommendations to our new mayor, inviting different stakeholders across different systems that impact early child education to really dive deep and make connections and build on a conversation to have a thoughtful, intentional, almost prescription of what needs to be focused on from various stakeholders. And I want to invite folks to join us and sign up and ask for more information. Our information should be showing up pretty soon.
Yep, we will share that. Thank you, Mel. At the conclusion of our conversation, we'll be sure to share all of those details with our audience. Thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your thoughts on, the importance of robust public funding for a high quality early education, system that is really truly accessible to all families. Thank you to everyone for tuning in today, to all of you watching and listening. I will leave you with this quote from Senator Bernie Sanders. The world has changed since the 1940s and 50s. Mom is in the workplace. Dad is in the workplace. We need a first-class childcare pre-K system in this country. And folks, what that means is that it must be quality, it must be affordable, it must be accessible, and it must allow for the investment in early childhood workforce. So thank you all for joining us, and take good care. Bye-bye for now.
Take care.